Hello, here's my little discourse to accompany the Monday Lab about hybrid, half-breed, racism, and related issues in role-playing. And the point being that in the Monday Lab, we talk a lot about half-orcs and half-elves, and I briefly mentioned some things that I didn't want to just turn into a great big presentation of my own during the interactive lab. Here, I will take some time to do that. First up is this game, relatively obscure, called Undiscovered. And Undiscovered is a fantasy game from the early 2000s. And I particularly want to focus on its supplement, one of the few supplements that was released for it, called Discovering Dusters. Dusters are one of the several races. The term is used in very traditional gaming fashion, and more or less interchangeable with species, and neither of them particularly well defined. In this game, as in so many others, they have divine origins, some of which were meddled with. Okay, in this case, dusters are the only one of these races which are older than humans, which is also divinely created and somewhat younger, and has become the big successful one. Again, you'll recognize this model from a lot of games. Well, the Dusters, what's so special about them? Specifically, that unlike all the other fantasy races, which are elves and dwarves and some dragon people and a number of things, unlike all the others, Dusters and humans not only can interbreed, but they frequently do when in contact. So the half Duster is a big deal. There aren't even any half elves, there's just elves, but there are half Dusters, half humans. So what's going on with that? Let's take a look at the Dusters as a group. In this diagram, you'll see that there are two branches of Dusters, one of which has a very basic pedigree in that they were created and have simply been living since, and today are, with very minor changes, are the Plains Dusters. Whereas the Desert Dusters are the result of some complicated history, scheming, gods, the creation of another group called the Dracomenses, who are another player character race with their various branches. All of that is kind of incidental to our point, just that the Desert Dusters have a slightly more complicated history, and in some are just another ecological variant of Dusters, which seems a little complicated for such an ordinary outcome, but there you are. Desert Dusters, Plains Dusters. They are very strongly analogous to fictional Native Americans, and they are were snakes. All peanut gallery commentary about why I would be so interested in the Dusters may now be concluded. And so you then have the outcomes in terms of today. Well, there are two kinds of humans in the setting, barbaric and civilized, and both of them interact with Dusters in their different ways. Barbaric humans, if they encroach into areas that Dusters live in, whether desert or plains, the barbaric humans have a tendency to want to live there too, and then the tribes clash. That's one thing. Another is that the civilized humans want to come in and cultivate, particularly the plains, or perhaps they have some river city or something like that in a desert area, and again, they start, cropping and agriculturing, and the Dusters get perturbed, and so there's clashes there too. All of which goes along with long-term cultural contact, and with a number of Dusters moving in with the humans, or a number of the humans in either capacity getting along pretty well with the local Dusters, or at least well enough. And so you end up with, apparently, a whole lot of sexual contact occurring. And then you get these outcomes. Well, first of all, just as a detail, apparently it only works with a male human and a female Duster. Well, that's it. Then we move on to looking at the result. You have in the game people who have one parent of one and one parent of the other. So you have literally your half-breed as an individual phenomenon. And they have their own set of rules in either case for either plains dusters or desert dusters. Then you have ongoing contact, the result of what is recognized as a population effect rather than an individual personal romantic history, I'm an exception effect. Instead, you have living in and among the dusters, or possibly in and among dusters who live with humans, you have an ongoing effect of what people are like in and among that population due to the heritage of both species involved. In the case of desert dusters, that is a rules category, a playable race, if you will, as well, called dravers. Now, dravers have their own rules. Then you have, over with plains dusters, interestingly enough, that effect is negligible, and individuals of that heritage are pretty much just humans. And whether they even look like dusters particularly is minimal to, or at least culturally negligible. So that's what's going on with the dusters, and what's a little odd about it is why there are no other such examples in that, in these rules in this game. If with the dusters, then why not anyone else? And number two, why not elves? Would go with that in particular, considering how much this game relies on the basic tropes of gaming fantasy. And then finally, and this is the interesting part for me, Undiscovered is an exceptionally well thought out and logical game in terms of all practical logistics of play. It's very much a point structure game, clearly heavily influenced by RuneQuest, and Rollmaster, very thoughtful, organized game. Point structure, advancement, skill definitions, magic groups, everything is very, very understandable and very codified. To what end is questionable. There is literally nothing in the setting that is compelling in terms of energizing play from a fictional standpoint. In many ways, it's a great deal of effort in order to arrive at a very static, fixed picture of extremely traditional fantasy tropes. And then you get better. The characters advance. And you're kind of like, well, what's interesting about a 6th level character? And the answer is nothing, except that it made sense to get there from a 1st level, and that's it. So then you look at the duster situation, and you see profound material available now. In the Discovering Dusters, there's a tribe creation technique. So you make a tribe, and then you're thinking about that tribe's contact with humans, and then you look at the rules for the half-dusters and then dravers and so on, and you're like, wow, there is a whole lot of material here that's playable. I mean, in terms of, I'm looking at this character, I'm looking at these characters, I'm looking at this location, and there's just so much that can go on in terms of setting up interesting circumstances for players to encounter, and also in terms of a player saying, well, I'm making a draver, and cool, who's my grandfather? Or this is my grandfather. And there's all kinds of things to work with. It's just rich. The contrast between it and every other element of the game's fiction is the gap in playable content is so striking. One would say, I mean, what I can't help but say, I mean, clearly somebody wanted to make a game about dusters and half-dusters. And for some reason, it's right there in the middle of this otherwise complete bland tapestry of basic and even surprisingly uncompelling, if detailed and logical, fantasy. All right, so much for Undiscovered. I'll put that on the playlist, Duster-wise, for sure.